Howdy, it's John here, and welcome back to the second installment of Voice of the Mesh, a podcast about everything Meshtastic and related. February may have been a short month, but it ended with quite a bang, so there's plenty to talk about. As a quick reminder, you'll find links to everything I talk about in the notes of your podcast player or linked on the Voice of the Mesh website. Finally, a word of housekeeping. As requested, this podcast is now available on most major platforms, including Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Spotify. With that, let's talk about the singular big headline of the month, Meshtastic 2.6 firmware preview. This was dropped on the blog on February 26th, aka 2/26, and it features a couple of really big changes. The first is the introduction of the Meshtastic user interface, or MUI. For devices with larger screens like the TDEC, the Unphone, also even systems like Raspberry Pi, you can now run this new GUI that really allows you to have a standalone Meshtastic device. Something fully functional, looks nice, and does not require a phone. Second on the list is another new user interface, this one called InkHUD. It's for e-ink devices, and currently supports a couple of Heltec and the LilyGo T-Echo. It's another case where there was nothing wrong with the existing UI on e-ink devices, but there is so much more that could be done, especially with some of the larger, nicer displays. So the developers built a really cool user interface for e-ink that I think is really going to make them much more popular. The final item on the large changes for 2.6 is one that is going to be less visible, but vastly important, especially for large meshes, and that is next hop routing for direct messages. This is a routing layer for Meshtastic, whereas in the past, everything was flooded out regardless. With this now directed messages, so that might be a DM to a person, a chat DM, or a direct message between two nodes, such as for remote node administration or node info requests, now have the capability of actually routing packets between nodes. This should help reduce mesh overhead overall and prevent messages from transiting hundreds of miles that they don't need to go. I did a full dedicated video on the 2.6 features, and there is more details on everything, and including what the next hop routing looks like on the Meshtastic blog, along with 3 other smaller features that I'm not going to talk about here. So watch the video or check the blog. As a reminder, 2.6 preview is pre-alpha, and it will not show in the web flasher unless you know the special code. It's hinted at on the blog. 2.6 is obviously a big deal right now, but there was still other firmware development going on, especially in the more stable releases. But before we get to those, just a reminder that constructive feedback is always welcome. Also, comment, subscribe, all that jazz, because apparently we're all obligated to say that, lest you've never listened to a podcast or watched a YouTube video. I'm sorry. I'll get back to the firmware now. 2.5.21 alpha. At the beginning of the month, they indicated that NRF52 devices, so those like the rack wireless, you should do a full erase and back up your node keys in case you care to help the performance of them. Honestly, you don't need to worry because if you upgrade to 2.6, it will erase your node anyways. With 2.5.21, power telemetry is broken, and in fact, that carries forward to 2.5.22. In 22, the TDEC and T-Watch got a Bluetooth fix, and the Seed Studio T1000E got some hardware updates, GPS fixes, and a battery estimation fix. That last of which is really nice for the average user. I thought it was amusing that my T1000E would stay on for 2 days and be at 50% battery, and then an hour later be dead, but not everyone found that as funny, so they have fixed the battery curve on that device. Finally, this month was the 2.5.23 alpha, which added support for the new MeshLink board. It's an open source hardware that you can find on GitHub if you want to make your own, but there's none for sale at the moment that I found. Also added support for the Xiao NRF52 and WIO SX1262 DIY from Seed Studio. This is probably one of the smallest Meshtastic nodes you can possibly build. They are just like postage stamp sized devices, and they're great for little remote sensors, or you just want to toss out a bunch of really small nodes. Although their radio is a little bit less powered, so don't think it will be a great router. They also added Wi-Fi support for the Raspberry Pi Pico 2W. Keep in mind that the Pico series is the Arduino-like microcontrollers. This is not for the full-fat Linux computer. And finally, adding support for the BMP390 precision pressure and altimeter sensor, which is really great if you care about really detailed pressure or altimetry data out of your Meshtastic hardware. 2.5.20 also hit beta. In the new hardware segment, we have the FemtoFox, which you will find on GitHub, and there's also a Hackster news article about it. The FemtoFox, as described on GitHub, is a Linux-based mesh development platform, a Raspberry Pi-sized computer with onboard LoRa radio, capable of being run with only 0.3 watts, making it ideal for solar-powered nodes. I did a quick short on this because I got one. It's pretty exciting to me. It's small, about the size of a T1000E, so credit card size, but this device runs real Linux. Yes, it's a stripped-down version of Ubuntu called Foxbuntu, but it's still a real computer. It's not a microcontroller. They also include a 30 dBm LoRa module and Ethernet, with an option for a real-time clock. So this is a fully featured device, which MSRP is for $65 in the US on Etsy, or £65 in the UK on Tindy, but it's currently sold out in the US as we speak. I am really excited about the FemtoFox. I have it here on my desk, and it will probably be my new router on my roof to replace my rack wireless. It's a little bit better, a little bit more powerful LoRa module, but more importantly, it just makes it easier to update when it's a Linux computer. I can SSH into it, and I can update Meshtastic D, and I don't need to climb onto the roof, which, even though it's fairly easy, my router on the roof is still running the 2.3.9 firmware from May 2024. So if I keep it much longer, it will be a year old. And no, I cannot access that device remotely anymore. The mobile apps do not support that old of firmware. In the realm of events, at the beginning of the month, on February 1 and 2, was FOSDEM, which is the Free and Open Source Developers European meeting. I mentioned this last month in Voice of the Mesh, but the video for the talk had not been posted. It is now up and available on the FOSDEM website, which is, again, linked in the show notes. This talk was given by Caveman99, aka Thomas. I'm sorry, I'm not going to butcher your last name. He did an excellent job talking about Meshtastic, but I'm also a little biased since he used some of my presentation as a basis, though he did a great job updating my hacked together presentation from long ago. Now we dive into the world of socials. The first is a video from the official Meshtastic channel from Jonathan Bennett. It's a 2-minute rundown of the Meshtastic designer, which I mentioned last month as it was on the blog previously. If you haven't tried the designer, he's got a quick rundown of what it looks like and what it's about. From Reddit, we have a post by Mystaclean123 about the ARRL's story titled Amateur Radio Emergency Preparedness Act Reintroduced. And the ARRL is the National Association for Amateur Radio here in the United States. The story, just the most important quote is, this act would require homeowners associations to accommodate the needs of FCC licensed amateur radio operators by prohibiting the enforcement of private land use restrictions that ban, prevent, or require the approval of the installation or use of amateur radio station antennas. Or to simplify, it forces HOAs to allow amateur radio antennas, which they tend not to like. A lot of the US has HOAs. It's annoying when you're an amateur radio operator and can't put up an antenna. I realize that not all Meshtastic users are hams. In fact, that's one of the joys of Meshtastic, is that you do not need a license. But this should help that Venn diagram crossover of people who use both. Though I will say that I think the community has done a great job so far of coming up with creative and clever ways of hiding Meshtastic nodes, be it in solar light enclosures or bird boxes. There's a number of different ways to hide Meshtastic nodes if you're in an HOA. From YouTube, the channel Digital Rancher brings us the video titled Meshtastic Mastered for Large Events. It's about a 10-minute overview of the general usage of Meshtastic at Hamcation 2025, which was in Florida earlier this month. There are some cool shots of the tower, some description of the infrastructure nodes, and just a little bit more about how Meshtastic was used at the event. If you're looking for tips and tricks on how to make Meshtastic work at your event, there's nothing rocket science in this video. The TLDRs, they used short, fast, and yelled at everyone to use client or client mute. Pretty standard stuff, to be honest. From Reddit, a Hugo96 posts about an aerial node for tracking, which is an 8 dB panel antenna mounted to the exterior of a plane, which was interesting. Honestly, it's a bit of a sales pitch for their team tracking product, but it was a cool concept nonetheless. We haven't seen a lot of Meshtastic radios mounted to the outside of planes, though I will say using Meshtastic on a plane is clearly common by the number of posts on Reddit. In fact, the San Francisco Bay Mesh found a lost balloon in the mountains using a happy coincidence of a Mesh member on a commercial flight who was willing to stick a Station G2 in the plane's window and managed to pick up a single packet, location packet from the lost balloon. And the next day, someone drove up and found it. So it does, in fact, work. We have a post from Haruki Toreda titled E213 Paper Mesh Build Update. Haruki is actually the original creator of the InkHUD UI. That's in the 2.6 firmware. But they are building a messenger-like product that's a Heltec Vision Master E213 e-ink display with the new InkHUD UI, of course, GPS, 5,000 milliamp hour battery, and an M5 stack card keyboard in a nice little case. I imagine that Haruki's probably going to try to sell it soon, but the instructions and build of material are on printables, so you can totally make your own. I love the idea of yet another device that's accessible to people easily, relatively cheap to build, and allows phone independence because the new InkHUD helps with that. And e-ink display plus a 5,000 milliamp hour battery is going to be great for battery life. Another from Reddit is Chrono Constant 3 posts his remote node in the wild update. It's a nice little field report of a successful deployment of Meshtastic in a tree. It also includes a nice build of material with a 10,000 milliamp hour battery, which makes sense for a remote solar only in a tree build, because I imagine that solar isn't easy to come by there. I really love to see these posts so that the entire community can learn how to build something, what works, what doesn't work. It's not just a, hey, I built a thing, but here's how it actually works in real life. And that is super useful. We're going to assume that Chrono Constant 3 had approval to use the land and use the tree that he put this node in, though we know certainly other people are a little bit more guerrilla in their tactics. On the more technical line of things, the Ori of Self, I'm going to assume that's how that's pronounced because they're clearly a Stargate fan, posts titled, added a 915 megahertz filter to my Station G2. Noticeable improvement to signal and range. Overall, this thread is a great conversation about the use of filters, where they do and don't work, and similarly detailed technical RF stuff. The Ori of Self notes that they are near an airport, so they get a lot of RF interference, and putting the filter on helped their pickup. This is not true of everyone. You don't necessarily need a 915 megahertz filter. I live in what is effectively suburbia. I put a filter on my router on the roof, and it really did not change much. My range is limited by geography rather than RF interference. So don't think that if you're not picking up people that you need to rush out and buy a filter to add. It may or may not be helpful. But my favorite find from that thread was a guide to filters posted by the Appalachian Mountain Mesh. They're located in Georgia and Tennessee. Finally, we have two fun little posts on Blue Sky. The first from Puget Mesh, which is the Seattle, Puget Sound, and surrounding areas, where they talk about their dual node infrastructure running both long fast and medium fast. They do a really good job of posting periodically about their new nodes and infrastructure that they're putting up and their coverage. Just in general, do a good job talking about their mesh, because it's really interesting to learn what these community meshes are doing and what is and isn't working. Another post comes from Bay Mesh, that's the San Francisco Bay Area, and they launched Meshtastic on a balloon, different balloon from the one I mentioned previously. It's a live posted thread, so there's a bunch of different updates. A rack whiz block and a T1000E went up to 107,000 feet of altitude and came back safe. The final report of 32,000 meters, 107,000 feet, was from the whiz block on long fast. Very standard configuration. Unfortunately, the T1000E tops out at 10 kilometers in altitude. It does not report GPS data any higher than that. The T1000E was running, I think, medium slow. The packets were working, but just there was no real location data. And I think that's because the T1000E has more strict don't use me as a missile protections. The final segment for today's show is actually from the socials, but something that I want to talk about in a little bit more depth, and that is Hypermesh. This originally comes from another YouTube video from the Digital Rancher channel titled Hypermesh Networking Unleashed. It caught my eye because, similar to MeshCore, which I mentioned last month, it's another new interesting mesh technology, but there was a lot more information here, and I have some thoughts. So first, unlike MeshCore, Hypermesh is by Spec5, who is a company that sells complete Meshtastic devices. They're a hardware vendor, and there's nothing wrong with that. Everything they sell, though, is very tactical. It feels a little marked up to me, but I want to be clear that I have never bought anything from Spec5, and I've never used it, never touched it hands-on. My opinions on how their hardware does and doesn't work mean very little, other than looking at their most basic radio and going, oof, that's $120, that's a lot. They may have an amazing setup. I did look around a little bit more on their site. They have a Ranger unit, which is obviously a LilyGo T-Deck that sells for $43 on LilyGo's website. And on Spec5, they're selling it for $180. Now, Spec5 does include a battery, case, antenna, and GPS, but you could also get the same thing from LilyGo as the T-Deck Plus for $71. Again, Spec5 is targeting that more tactical market. They may have a better case and a better setup. I'm not saying either way. But back to Hypermesh. They discussed a number of points about Hypermesh in this Digital Rancher video that's about 9 minutes long. One of the things that caught my eye is they're talking about wanting to make something better for commercial users or introductory customers. They stated that often open source has too many options, and they want something that's easier and simpler, so not necessarily designed for the technical user. And now, I think that they are not wrong. Open source oftentimes does get not opinionated enough. That there are too many ways to skin the cat, and new users get scared by that. They just want someone to come in and tell them what to do and how to use it. And if you look at how popular Apple devices are, there's clearly a large market for just tell me what to do. So user-friendly is good. As someone who has worked under the Meshtastic banner at events, has spoken to hundreds, if not thousands of people about Meshtastic, I definitely want Meshtastic to be user-friendly. I want it to be easy. I want it to be something that you can give to your mom, who is capable of sending text messages and can figure out how to use Meshtastic. We're not quite there yet. Taking a different approach that Spec5 and Hypermesh is to make it more user-friendly is not a bad thing. The targeting commercial users, I'll come back to in a minute, though. They talk about their interface being more graphic, but it's not clear what that means. The only thing they show is the list of nodes around you is more like AirDrop than it is like a list of nodes like you see in Meshtastic. It's still using an app on the phone or tablet. Right now, HyperMesh is clearly very early on. It just sends text. There's no other new features or fanciness. They also opted to use Wi-Fi instead of Bluetooth for communicating between the phones and the nodes for longer range, faster purposes, but it's not really clear as to why or what benefit that is. At the end of the day, Bluetooth is still faster than LoRa. I guess if you're transferring a lot of data, Bluetooth or Wi-Fi would be more useful or more reliable. These nodes that they're using are ESP32 based, so if you've got a shitty 2.4 gigahertz antenna, it's not going to go well for range either way. They are talking about investigating reticulum, though it was not clear in the video if they wanted that as part of HyperMesh or just another way to sell hardware. Would make perfect sense if they're going to sell reticulum hardware alongside Meshtastic hardware alongside HyperMesh hardware. Also, you can use the web browser to log into these ESP32 HyperMesh devices as well. Though to be clear, they have effectively no user interface on the nodes themselves. It's either a web interface or the mobile apps. There's also no discussion of routing or anything like that at this point in time. I tried to find more information, but in doing so, I found out that they will probably be forced to change their name of HyperMesh here in the near future, as HyperMesh is the registered trademark of Altair Engineering and is a piece of 3D modeling software or something tangentially related to it. So putting HyperMesh into Google or YouTube just gets you a bunch of 3D modeling software videos. At the end of the day, my concern with HyperMesh is that this will be Gotenna all over again. Instead of building community interest off a Kickstarter, they're doing it off Meshtastic, and then they will pivot into commercial clients, which inevitably becomes emergency services, law enforcement, military, etc. Now, to be clear, for Spec 5, it's a great business model. It's super lucrative. You can look at Gotenna. They've been chugging away for more than a decade now, selling devices to first responders and military and making a bunch of money. It just is potentially terrible for the average consumer, because if you buy a HyperMesh specific device, which they're not selling today, but if that does exist, it may not be Meshtastic compatible, and they have not stated but implied that it is not going to be open source. That means you could end up with another mesh device for another mesh that you get left behind on because you're not willing to spend $2,000 on a new mesh node that is this new cool HyperMesh business model because you're not a commercial user. A lot of this is speculation, to be clear. I'm not trying to harp on Spec 5 here. I am, like MeshCore, going to keep an eye on it, going to look at it and keep an open mind. I just worry that community members will see this as a new cool alternative, spend a bunch of money on it, and end up with a bunch of bricks. And without the HyperMesh software eventually becoming open source, I would not trust it to survive. So on that cheerful note, we are done for the month. I want to thank you for sticking through to the end. As a reminder, links for everything that I talk about today will be in the show notes. And once again, I want to put a call out for suggestions. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can just comment on the YouTube video. You can @ me on bsky, or you can post in the Discord. The links will be at the top of your show notes. I really want to include more from the community, more cool events, more things that your meshes are doing. So if you're listening to this and your mesh has done something cool or interesting, or you're also launching balloons and trying to do something different, please let me know. I would love to talk about it on next month's show. So until then, stay safe.